bum 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 bum. Ha 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 ha. Gloria in excelsis Deo. The Divine Comedy Podcast.
Welcome to the notes over Dantes Inferno for Mr. Nance's class. We're going to start with an introduction to Dantes Inferno, and then talk about Canto 1 today. Dantes Inferno is one of those books you can read on so many different layers. You can look at the surface, or you can delve in deep. The first time I read the book, I read it in high school. I read it because one of my friends said it was cool. I picked it up, and I read a story that was grotesque and exciting and full of adventure. And that's about all I got out of it. I could see that there was a whole lot of symbolism in there, and I knew there was a lot I didn't understand. But from my perspective, it looked like Dante had just decided to write a story about all the people he didn't like and put them in a terrible afterlife. But each time I've read it since, I've seen a new layer of detail. In fact, I would go so far as to say Dante's Inferno, as part of the overall Divine Comedy, is one of the most complex and layered pieces of literature you'll ever read. Complexity is a good thing. It makes things deep and exciting. Instead of just reading on the surface, getting a general story, and moving on, you could begin to delve deeper and deeper and deeper and begin to see it on all new levels. And as you do that, there's a new level of excitement and engagement that comes. So to start with, Dante's Inferno is actually the first part of the three-sectioned Divine Comedy, a larger work that tells the story of Dante's trip through hell and purgatory and ultimately heaven. He sees all of these different places of the afterlife. In fact, the Divine Comedy is something of an encyclopedia. It attempts to cover everything about humanity in one book. The first section, Dante's Inferno, shows all of human failure and flaw. The second section, Purgatorio, shows the idea of redemption and penitence. And the third section shows the idea of all of the good that humanity can do. As you read the Divine Comedy and the Inferno, you'll notice that the number 3 is extremely important and very symbolic. There are 3 sections to the Divine Comedy, as I said, the Inferno, the Purgatorio, and the Paradiso. But also, everything else is divided into 3s as well. Hell, in the Inferno, is divided into 3 major sections, and ultimately those are broken down into 9 circles. All right, 3 times 3. Also, the rhyme scheme is the famous terza rima, which is a kind of rhyme based on the number 3. Midway through the journey of our life, I found myself in a dark wood, for I had strayed from the straight pathway to this tangled ground. How hard it is to tell of, overlaid with harsh and savage growth, so wild and raw, the thought of it still makes me feel afraid. If you listen to the rhyme scheme, you can hear the rhyme scheme based upon 3. It's in 3-line sections. The first 3 lines is A, B, A. The second 3 lines picks up that middle rhyme and carries it onward, B, C, B. The third section, C, D, C, and so on throughout the poem. Not only that, but each of the major sections of the Divine Comedy is made up of 33 cantos, or chapters. The Inferno is the only exception to that rule, having 34 cantos, but really technically the first canto is an introduction to the entire work. So 3s, 33s, 9s, everything divided into 3. What does 3 mean anyway? Well, 3 is a significant symbol in Christian literature. It represents the Trinity, or the idea of God and the divine. This is, after all, the Divine Comedy. It's a comedy about the supernatural and particularly about the afterlife. But as I said, it's not just about the afterlife, it's actually about humanity. And it's actually about what humanity is like and how we achieve greatness or achieve failure. Okay, so the title of the overall work, not just the first part, but the overall work is the Divine Comedy. Divine Comedy. In the title, we have the idea of divine, which we've just mentioned, but there's also the idea of comedy. You might think of something that's funny, but comedy isn't just something that's funny, it's something that fits a certain plot structure. In a comedy, there's a character who experiences a fall, but then, through some sort of means, maybe inside of himself, or more likely outside of himself, he is picked up and placed back in a state of happiness. Comedies end well, as opposed to tragedies which end horribly. So, the difference between comedy and tragedy is really in that. Now, when Dante says divine comedy, he's trying to take comedy, which was considered for many, many years a light form of literature. It's not as deep and as intense as tragedy. But he's taking comedy, this light form of literature, and elevating it, raising it up, making it deep as well. Because, as I said, this is one of the most complex and most intense books you'll ever read. He's taking the idea of comedy and making it something deep and rich and all about not only human failure, which most comedy is about, but about human strength. Now, there's some other things that you might need to know in order to enjoy this book. There's a lot of stuff hidden in this book that has to do with Dante's own life. And if you know nothing about Dante, you lose a lot of the details. Dante was a very significant poet in Italy in the late 1200s, early 1300s. In fact, the book itself is set in 1300 even. There's a few instances in Dante's life that really pivotally influence the writing of this book. The most important event in Dante's life was his exile out of Florence. Florence was his hometown. He loved the town. He tried to make the town stronger. He got into politics, which led to some bad things. See, Florence was suffering from civil war during this time period. There were two major groups, the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. The Ghibellines were very much siding with the Pope and with the church having absolute political power, whereas the Guelphs more wanted to side with the Holy Roman Emperor and give him political power. The two fought terrible wars against each other. Ultimately, back and forth, the Guelphs drove the Ghibellines out. But once the Guelphs were free to rule Florence by themselves, what did they do? They broke into two groups and started fighting among themselves. You have the White Guelphs and the Black Guelphs. Dante was a White Guelph. Once again, they were still fighting over power and who has the power. Dante will comment very heavily on the dangers of the church getting mixed up in politics. When the church gets mixed in politics, it gets mixed in greed and envy and all of these terrible kinds of sins that become the basis of going to hell. Dante saw firsthand how religious leaders with political ambition could tear apart and destroy a town. The White and the Black Guelphs battled back and forth. Dante, as a White Guelph, was trying to find stability for Florence, trying to finally get it out of this time of horrible civil war. In order to do that, he had to exile some of those Black Guelphs that were causing violence and destruction in his town, including one of his best friends. More on that later. After the White Guelphs had finally achieved some sense of stability in Florence, Dante was sent to the Pope to try to negotiate, to try to seal this peace once and for all. While he was out of town, though, the Black Guelphs came back in and took over and exiled the White Guelphs and sent Dante a message saying, if you ever come back, we'll kill you. So Dante was homeless and wandering around Italy. And unlike today, where I might just easily hop over to the next town and have just as good of a life over there, Italy was much different. It was very segmented, and even the dialect from one region of Italy to another were different. The political systems from one section of Italy to another were different. It was very diverse. Being exiled from town was kind of like being exiled from your country. The other thing in Dante's life that really influenced his poetry, and particularly the Divine Comedy, was his relationship with a woman named Beatrice. And when I say relationship, I'm really saying non-relationship. Beatrice was a woman he saw when he was younger and fell madly in love with. He didn't really talk to her much at all, like maybe 5 words his whole life. But he was completely in love with her forever, and she was his ideal woman, the perfect woman. He went on to marry someone else, she went on to marry someone else, she died. And here he was left with this idealized vision of a woman who probably wasn't really actually even anything like the woman she was. But he spends the rest of his life writing poetry for her and about how perfect she is. His first big work of poetry, the Vita Nuova, is all about his life, his biography, told through his love for Beatrice. And ultimately, the Vita Nuova concludes with the idea that I've tried to say the perfect thing. I've tried to elevate love poetry to the pinnacle, and I haven't achieved it yet. So until I can write a poem worthy of you, I'm going to stop. Ultimately, the Divine Comedy becomes his poem to Beatrice, this ultimate poem of all humanity, all that's bad and good in us, in a celebration of Beatrice. Beatrice is an extremely important figure in the Divine Comedy, although she barely shows up in the Inferno. She's the one who finds Dante when he's going astray and guides him back to the path, and then, when he gets to heaven, she's going to be his guide. She represents everything that's beautiful and good and perfect about love It's this idea of courtly love, which was very significant to the Middle Ages. And courtly love is not the kind of love where you really get with the person. Courtly love is love from afar, love that's pure and chaste, love that is for a person who you will never, ever, ever get. In fact, the name Beatrice is so significant because of her influence on Dante that every time you see the name Beatrice, it's probably a reference to her. So Dante, in exile, depressed, goes out and wanders around for a while until finally he begins to write. And he writes his masterpiece, the piece that will make him one of the most important poets of all time. And as we begin the Divine Comedy, we start in Inferno with Canto 1. Canto 1, as I said, is an introduction to the entire Divine Comedy, and it touches on some of the most important ideas in why he's writing this. Midway through the journey of our life, I found myself in a dark wood, for I had strayed from the straight pathway to this tangled ground. Those first 3 lines I could talk about for a long time. And I will! He says midway through the journey of our life. And he's talking about the middle of his age. As I said, the book is set in 1300, when Dante was 35, and he believes that's the perfect middle of your life. There's a reference in the Bible to humanity being allotted 70 years, and so 35 is half of 70, therefore it's the middle of life. But 1300 is also important because 1300 is 2 years before he's exiled. In retrospect, he's setting this book 2 years before his exile as a story that prepares him for exile. But he doesn't just say midway through the journey of my life, he said midway through the journey of our life, which emphasizes that this isn't just about him, this is a macrocosm, this is all of humanity that he's talking about here. Don't forget that Dante considers this book an encyclopedia, an encompassing of all of humanity and all that humanity can be and all that humanity does. So the idea that it's not just his journey, but everyone's journey, is significant to the text. We might be familiar with this idea from Joseph Campbell's concept of the hero's journey, from his book Hero with a Thousand Faces. It's the idea that every story is essentially the same, that all stories are about humanity striving to overcome obstacles, striving to find ourselves, and to be what we ought to be. Dante's journey becomes a hero's journey. He's on a quest to rediscover himself and to rediscover all of humanity in the process. It's also interesting how he discusses the idea of life being a journey. We're pretty familiar with that metaphor, life is a journey. But in medieval ideology, a journey was depicted as a line. On the other hand, a spiritual quest is a circle. The soul goes out and then returns to its place. In fact, all things that are associated with the divine and with heavenly are depicted as circles. So as Dante goes through this quest, he's going to pass through a lot of circles, but he's going to go in a line. What happens when you combine a line and a circle? You get a spiral. And that's why everything that Dante does is not just a journey or a quest, and it's not just a circular return of his soul in the same place over and over again, but it's a spiritual journey. He is both being spiritual in the circle, and he's going on a journey to accomplish something in the line. But what does he find as he's midway through life's journey? Midway through the journey of our life, I found myself in a dark wood, for I had strayed from the pathway to this tangled ground. He discovers that he's no longer going the right direction. He's on the journey of life, but he's gone off course. What does that mean? Well, there's lots of different interpretations. The most obvious and the most easy conclusion to jump to is that he has sinned, and because of his sin, he's no longer going the right direction. After all, he can no longer seem to get to heaven, which sounds like a sin. On the other hand, it may just be general doubt. He's lost his way in life, and he doesn't really know who he is or what he needs to be. This ties in nicely with the idea of exile that's coming up soon. He loses his way, and because he loses his way, he also loses his place in life. And he finds that the place he comes to is a tangled ground. It's a dark wood. How hard it is to tell of, overlaid with harsh and savage growth so wild and raw, the thought of it still makes me feel afraid. Here he is, and he's lost, and he's confused, and he no longer knows how to get back where he needs to be in his life. It's interesting to note that what's going on here in this story has 2 layers. One, you have the story, where Dante, as a traveler, is going on a journey, and he's experiencing certain physical things. On the other hand, it's allegorical, it's symbolic. A dark wood is, in the story, a dark wood that he's lost in. but it also represents something. It represents the confusion in his soul and his inability to get back where he needs to be. All throughout his journey through the Inferno and then on, it's going to talk about things in multi-layers. And we're going to talk a lot more about different types of allegory as we go through this. But another thing to note here is the idea that he remembers his journey. It says, the thought of it still makes me feel afraid. So he's not in the dark wood anymore. He's gotten out of it. And now he is writing about the experience and reflecting back on it. That means there's two Dantes we're talking about here. One, Dante the traveler, who is going to be undergoing great and terrible dangers. And two, Dante the poet, who is also going to be undergoing great and terrible dangers, but in a different way. This is very significant all throughout the Inferno and through the rest of the Divine Comedy. The idea that there are two Dantes. We see that the first Dante has to experience all of these physical problems. But the second Dante, the poet, the one who is looking back at his experience and writing about it, also has to deal with pride. He goes on to talk about how he got here in the dark wood. And really, his problem is that he wasn't paying enough attention. Just how I entered there I cannot say, so full of sleep when I begun to veer, that I did not see that I had gone astray from the one true path. We're about to deal with all of human failure, and one way you can fail is by not paying enough attention. On the other hand, you can also fail by deliberately doing wrong, and Dante is going to organize hell based upon willfulness. Your will, your desire, your intent, what motivates you to do what you need to do is an extremely important idea in the Inferno. Your will can lead you into a lot of wrong, and it can't always get you back out again. Dante's lack of attention got him into this wood, but he discovers that it's much easier to get into than get back out of. But once I had drawn near to the bottom of a hill at the far remove of the valley that had pierced my heart with fear, I saw its shoulders mantled from above by the warm rays of the planet that gives light to guide our steps wherever we may rove. At last I felt some calming of the fright that had allowed the lake of my heart no rest while I endured the long and piteous night. So he looks up and he sees the sun. Now the sun is extremely symbolic, and I always like to ask my students what they think the sun represents. And I get all kinds of answers. The sun might represent heaven and God and good things like that. And that's a good possibility, but it's probably not right. Because after all, as he turns towards the good and towards heaven, he can't get there. He's blocked. A clearer possibility might be that the sun represents reason. And a good precedent for this is Plato's allegory of a cave. If we look back to the classical story of Plato's allegory of a cave, Plato describes, through the voice of Socrates, what true philosophy is. He envisions a bunch of people bound in a cave and chained up, and they're looking at shadows on a wall that are cast by firelight. And they get very good at depicting what, or guessing what these shadows represent. But finally, one of them is freed and set out of the cave in the sunlight. At first, he's blinded, he can't see anything. But as his eyes adapt and as he grows clearer in his vision, he begins to see the world as it really is. And he says, wow, the world is wonderful and amazing, and all those things we saw down there, those were just shadows. Those weren't real. He runs down into the cave and eagerly tells his friends, look, this isn't real. These are just shadows. Come up to the light and see the true world. Well, it doesn't work because they don't believe him, first of all, and second of all, after his eyes have adapted to the light, he can no longer see the shadows as well. Plato is arguing that philosophy is important, and philosophy opens us up to see the world more brightly and more vividly and more sincerely than anyone else. We're caught up in our simple human games and our simple human tainted vision, and we don't see anything but shadows. But if we were to look to the light, we would see so much more. This is a great allegory and frequently alluded to. But Dante here doesn't think that it's enough. Philosophy cannot save you sometimes. Sometimes in the midst of despair and confusion, you turn to philosophy, but something bars your way. You just can't make it there. But I had hardly started when I spied a leopard in my pathway, lithe and fleet, all covered with a sleek and spotted hide. And as I faced it, it would not retreat, but pace before me, and so blocked my way that more than once I had to turn my feet to retrace my steps. The sweet season of the year and the hour made me think that I might try to evade the bright-skinned beast as it came near, but then I felt my good hopes quickly fade, and in an instant I was numbed with fear to see a lion in my path that made straight for me, head held high and ravenous, and seemed to make the very air afraid. and a she-wolf, too, that in its leanness was laden with every craving. Those who seek fulfillment there find only wretchedness. So there are three creatures blocking his way, not allowing him to go up the hill to the sun, to philosophy, to reason. The three creatures are a leopard, a lion, and a she-wolf. Now, the she-wolf is fairly clearly explained because at the end it says that in its leanness was laden with every craving. Those who seek fulfillment there find only wretchedness. The idea that the she-wolf represents cravings, the urges that we have that lead us to wrong. The leopard also is frequently depicted as representing duplicity because the spots are a way of hiding or disguising itself or being something it's not. Fraudulence, in other words. And also the lion representing fierceness and violence. So we see three different layers that we're going to see again as soon as we descend into the Inferno. The kinds of sins that are done through lusts and urges, the kinds of sin that are done through anger and violence, and the kinds of sins that are done calculated and fraudulently. As we said a moment ago, Dante is going to organize hell based upon will. The least significant sins, the lightest sins, are those that are done impulsively, the ones that we simply fall into because we aren't paying enough attention, like Dante was neglectful on his journey. The second are the violent ones that come from anger. They're more willful and more carefully enacted than the previous, but they're still not quite so thought out as the final set. The final set are the fraudulent sins. They're sins of calculation and will, where you carefully plot your plans and you enact them in order to do evil. These are the coldest and the hardest of the sins. So Dante's in bad shape. He doesn't know what to do, and he turns to the first person he sees. He sees a figure stepping through the woods, and he cries out, "Mercy!" which sounds like a prayer. It turns out that this isn't a person at all. This is a ghost. But it's a ghost of somebody worth talking to.
I was a poet, and I sang of him, Anchises' righteous son, who sailed from Troy after the burning of proud Ilium.
It's Virgil, Dante's favorite poet. Now, why is Virgil Dante's favorite poet? Well, the easiest explanation is that it's his national poet. Virgil is the epic poet of Rome. What Homer is to the Greeks, Virgil is to the Romans. And of course, Dante, as an Italian and as a descendant of the Romans, he values Virgil above all. He's also going to use the stories that Virgil tells as a precedent for his own story. The idea of Aeneas, who's on his journey home, trying to find his new home. Dante is also on his journey, trying to find his home. But Virgil isn't just a poet. Virgil represents poetry in general, and also poetry that can lead you to great thought and reason. Virgil points him towards the mountain, even though Dante is unable to assail it. Virgil guides him as far as poetry can take him, and is a good guide, can get him a lot farther than his own desires and his own will can get him. Dante praises Virgil for a while, and then describes how the beasts have stopped him. "It were best to go another way around," he answered, seeing tears start from my eyes, "if your hope is to escape this savage ground. Because this creature that provokes your cries allows no man to get the best of her, but blocks each one, attacking till he dies." Virgil mentions another way, but what is the other way out of his troubles? "Therefore, I think it would be best for you to follow me. I will be your guide, and I will lead you out of here and take you through an eternal place where you will be greeted by the shriekings of despair, and you will see ancient, tormented spirits as they cry aloud at the second death. Then you will be with those who are content within the fire, for they hope to join the blessed eventually. You will see those blessed, if that is your desire, with a worthier soul than I. Into her hands I will entrust you when I can go no higher." So, Virgil can lead Dante through the Inferno, through hell. He can lead him through purgatory, the place of purification where the souls have hope. But ultimately, he can't lead him all the way into heaven. This is important. Dante puts a lot of value on poetry, but even poetry isn't enough to get you through. It can take you a good ways, but it can't get you to heaven. Who does he need to get him all the way into heaven? He needs divine love. And where does that divine love come from? Beatrice, of course! Beatrice is going to show up and rescue him at the last minute. In fact, she's already played a role in his rescuing. We just don't know about it yet. "Poet," I said to him, "so that I may escape this harm and worse that may await, in the name of that God you never knew, I pray you lead me out to see St. Peter's gate, and all those souls that you have told me of who must endure their miserable state." I followed him as he began to move.
Bum 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 bum. It's Inferno, Inferno, ba dum bum bum bum.